Moscow, November 14th, 1979, 11:47 p.m. In a cramped fourth-floor apartment on Leninsky Prospect, a GRU major named Dmitry Polyakov sat at his kitchen table with a glass of Georgian cognac and a loaded Makarov pistol. The cognac was a gift from his American handlers. The pistol was standard issue from the Soviet Military Intelligence Directorate he'd served for 23 years. For the past 18 years, he'd also been serving the Central Intelligence Agency under the cryptonym Top Hat, later upgraded to GT Bourbon when his value became undeniable. What made this moment extraordinary wasn't the double life. Moscow in 1979 was thick with such men, but what Polyakov had written in the leather journal now opened before him. A meticulously detailed confession addressed to no one, cataloging every document he'd passed, every dead drop he'd serviced, every lie he'd told to both sides. He was 52 years old. He had 3 children, and he had genuinely forgotten which betrayal had been the original one. The Cold War produced thousands of double agents, but Polyakov's case remains singular in the annals of espionage precisely because of what he destroyed. Not merely classified programs or operational networks, but the foundational assumption that human beings engaged in sustained deception retain a stable sense of self. By the time Soviet counterintelligence arrested him in 1986, Polyakov had compromised over 25 Soviet intelligence operations, caused the recall or exposure of dozens of officers, and fed the CIA's understanding of Soviet military doctrine for nearly 2 decades. Yet the transcripts of his interrogation, partially declassified in 2003, reveal a man who could no longer articulate a coherent motive. He had not defected ideologically. He had not been blackmailed. He had not sought wealth. His CIA payments, totaling over $2 million, sat untouched in a Virginia bank account he'd never accessed. When asked why he'd done it, Polyakov's answer, recorded by KGB debriefers on July 8, 1986, was, "I served both. I believed in both. I don't know when I stopped being able to tell the difference. To understand how a man could reach such a state requires going back to 1961, to the mechanics of his recruitment, and to the particular psychological architecture of deep cover work during the Cold War's most paranoid decade. The question isn't how Polyakov was turned. That process was almost banal in its simplicity, but how 18 years of sustained duplicity eroded the cognitive boundaries that separate loyalty from treason, until both became indistinguishable. Dmitry Fedorovich Polyakov was born in 1921 in Ukhtomsky, a village in the Ryazan Oblast southeast of Moscow. His father was a railway engineer. His mother taught primary school. The family was neither privileged nor suspect, occupying that narrow band of Soviet society that could aspire to advancement through technical competence and ideological reliability. Polyakov joined the Red Army in 1939, served with distinction during the Great Patriotic War as an artillery officer, and was recruited into the GRU, Soviet Military Intelligence, in 1946. His profile was ideal: war hero credentials, no aristocratic or bourgeois background, fluent German, and a talent for what his personnel file described as operational patience. By 1951, he was stationed in East Berlin as a case officer managing agents in the West German government. By 1958, he'd been promoted to major and assigned to the GRU's New York Residentura, operating under diplomatic cover at the Soviet mission to the United Nations. It was in New York, in the spring of 1961, that the FBI's Counterintelligence Division first identified Polyakov as a potential recruitment target. The identification wasn't the result of sophisticated profiling, but of mundane observation. Polyakov had been seen, on 3 separate occasions, sitting alone in Central Park reading American newspapers Not Pravda or official Soviet bulletins, but the New York Times and the Herald Tribune. He lingered over the editorial pages. He took notes. This behavior, while not overtly suspicious, suggested a man engaging with Western perspectives beyond the minimum required for his cover role. The FBI's New York field office flagged him for assessment. The case was handed to the CIA's Soviet Russia division. The approach, when it came, was executed with a precision that bordered on theatrical. On June 22, 1961, Polyakov received a phone call at his apartment on East 67th Street. The caller, speaking unaccented Russian, identified himself as a representative of concerned Americans and proposed a meeting to discuss matters of mutual philosophical interest. The phrasing was deliberate, vague enough to allow deniability, specific enough to signal intent. Polyakov, trained to recognize recruitment pitches, should have reported the contact immediately to his GRU superior. Instead, he agreed to meet. The location was a bench near the Bethesda Fountain in Central Park. The time was 3:00 p.m. on June 25th. The CIA officer who met Polyakov that afternoon was a veteran of Soviet operations named Frank Freiberg, operating under the alias Robert Carlson. Freiberg's approach was not to offer money, ideology, or blackmail, but to pose a question. Do you believe the system you serve is capable of reform, or only of replication? The question was designed to exploit a fracture the CIA's psychological assessment had identified in Polyakov's profile. A tension between his genuine belief in Soviet socialism's theoretical ideals and his growing disillusionment with its bureaucratic sclerosis and moral compromises. Polyakov did not answer immediately. He sat in silence for nearly 4 minutes, a duration Freiberg noted in his contact report. Then he said, "I will think about your question." He stood and walked away. No arrangement for further contact was made. 3 weeks later, on July 18, 1961, Polyakov left a chalk mark on a mailbox at the corner of Lexington Avenue and 68th Street, a signal the CIA had provided during that first meeting as a means of initiating secure communication. The mark indicated he was ready to talk. The second meeting occurred on July 22nd in a safe house in Queens. This time, Polyakov brought something: a single page of GRU operational cable traffic, detailing the identities of 3 Soviet illegals operating in the United States under deep cover. He placed it on the table and said, "This is not for money. This is because you asked the right question." The mechanics of Polyakov's operation, from 1961 to 1980, followed a pattern of escalating trust and deepening compartmentalization. Initially, his intelligence was limited to biographical data on GRU personnel and assessments of Soviet intelligence priorities. By 1963, he was providing copies of classified cables. By 1965, he was photographing documents from the GRU's central registry during his rotations back to Moscow. The CIA's handling protocol was meticulous. Dead drops in New York, later in Moscow and New Delhi when Polyakov was reassigned, encrypted shortwave radio communications, and a strict prohibition on face-to-face meetings except under emergency conditions. Polyakov's tradecraft was flawless. He was never late to a drop. He never deviated from protocol. His intelligence was consistently accurate, verifiable, and actionable. What made Polyakov invaluable was not merely the volume of his reporting, but its strategic depth. In 1962, he provided the CIA with detailed assessments of Soviet missile capabilities that directly informed the Kennedy administration's calculations during the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1968, he delivered the GRU's internal analysis of the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, including contingency plans for NATO responses. In 1973, he supplied technical specifications for the SS-20 intermediate-range ballistic missile, intelligence that shaped U.S. arms control negotiating positions throughout the decade. By 1979, the CIA's Soviet-Russia division estimated that Polyakov's contributions had prevented at least 2 major intelligence failures and provided strategic advantage in at least a dozen key Cold War flashpoints. Yet the psychological cost of this sustained duplicity was catalogued in the journals Polyakov kept from 1967 onward. Journals discovered by the KGB after his arrest and partially excerpted in post-Soviet archival releases. The entries reveal a man experiencing what intelligence psychologists later termed identity diffusion under operational stress. In a March 1970 entry, Polyakov wrote, "I briefed the resident today on American defensive postures. I used the intelligence I myself provided to the Americans. I argued against my own analysis. I convinced him I was right. Which version was the lie?" By 1975, the entries had become more fragmented. Served Moscow today. Served Langley yesterday. Served both. Served neither. The words have lost meaning. The operational paradox Polyakov embodied was this: to be effective as a penetration agent, he had to remain a trusted, high-performing officer within the GRU. This required not merely maintaining cover, but genuinely advancing Soviet intelligence objectives. Polyakov did precisely that. Between 1961 and 1980, he successfully recruited at least 6 Western sources for the GRU, ran productive operations against NATO targets, and received commendations for his service. The intelligence he provided to Moscow was real, valuable, and often damaging to Western interests. The CIA was aware of this and accepted it as the cost of maintaining his access. But for Polyakov, the cognitive dissonance was unsustainable. He was not pretending to serve the Soviet Union while secretly serving America. He was genuinely serving both, with equal commitment and equal betrayal. The turning point, the moment when Polyakov's dual loyalties ceased to be a manageable operational burden and became an existential crisis, occurred in December 1977, during a routine debriefing session in Moscow. Polyakov had just returned from a posting in New Delhi, where he'd serviced dead drops for the CIA while simultaneously running a successful GRU operation against Indian defense officials. His Moscow debriefer, a colonel named Grigory Svetlov, asked him a standard question: "In your assessment, what is the current state of American intelligence penetration of our South Asian operations?" Polyakov's answer, delivered without hesitation, was a precise and accurate summary of CIA capabilities in the region, capabilities he himself had helped build. Svetlov praised the analysis. Polyakov left the meeting and vomited in a ministry restroom. In his journal that night, he wrote, "I have become a perfect mirror. I reflect what each side wants to see. But there is nothing behind the glass." By 1980, Polyakov's intelligence production had begun to decline. His reports to the CIA became less frequent, less detailed. His GRU performance reviews noted decreased initiative and signs of operational fatigue. The CIA's Moscow station chief, concerned about potential compromise, sent an encrypted message asking if Polyakov wished to exfiltrate. Polyakov's response, delivered via shortwave on April 3, 1980, was, "I cannot leave. I am needed here. I am needed there. I am needed nowhere." The CIA interpreted this as a refusal based on family concerns. Polyakov's wife and children were in Moscow, and exfiltration would have required leaving them behind. But the journals suggest a different motive. Polyakov had come to believe that his dual role was itself the mission, that the act of serving both sides simultaneously had become the only coherent identity he possessed. The exposure, when it came, was not the result of Polyakov's mistakes, but of betrayal by another double agent. In 1985, Aldrich Ames, a CIA counterintelligence officer, began selling the identities of U.S. agents within the Soviet Union to the KGB. Polyakov's name was on the list Ames provided in June 1985. The KGB, however, did not arrest Polyakov immediately. Instead, they placed him under intensive surveillance, seeking to understand the full scope of his network and to identify his CIA contacts. For nearly a year, Polyakov continued his routine, unaware that every dead drop, every encrypted transmission, every clandestine meeting was being documented. The KGB's goal was not merely to arrest a spy, but to dismantle the CIA's entire Moscow apparatus. Polyakov was arrested on July 7, 1986, at his dacha outside Moscow. The arrest was conducted by a KGB team led by Colonel Viktor Cherkashin, the same officer who had handled Ames. Polyakov did not resist. According to Cherkashin's later account, Polyakov's first words upon arrest were, "Which service sent you?" When told he was being detained by the KGB for treason against the Soviet Union, Polyakov reportedly laughed and said, "Only one? I expected both." The interrogation of Dmitry Polyakov lasted 14 months and produced over 3,000 pages of transcripts. The KGB's objective was to extract a full confession, identify all CIA contacts, and reconstruct the entire timeline of his espionage. What they got instead was a psychological document of profound disorientation. Polyakov confirmed the basic facts: the 1961 recruitment, the dead drops, the documents, the payments. But when pressed on motive, he offered contradictory explanations. In one session, he claimed ideological disillusionment with Soviet bureaucracy. In another, he said he'd been motivated by intellectual curiosity about American methods. In a third, he insisted he'd never betrayed the Soviet Union because he'd simultaneously been serving it. The interrogators, trained to extract coherent narratives, found themselves confronting a man who appeared to have genuinely lost the ability to distinguish between loyalty and treason. One exchange, recorded on September 12, 1986, is particularly revealing. The interrogator asked, "Did you believe you were serving the Soviet Union when you passed classified documents to the CIA?" Polyakov answered, "Yes." The interrogator then asked, "Did you believe you were serving the United States when you recruited agents for the GRU?" Polyakov answered, "Yes." The interrogator, frustrated, demanded, "How can both be true?" Polyakov's response, "I don't know. I used to know. I can't remember when I stopped knowing. The trial was held in secret, as was standard for espionage cases involving classified material. Polyakov was charged with high treason under Article 64 of the Soviet Criminal Code. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence: copies of the documents he'd photographed, records of dead drop servicing, testimony from KGB surveillance teams, and Polyakov's own partial confessions. The defense, such as it was, argued diminished capacity due to psychological breakdown. A state psychiatrist evaluated Polyakov and concluded he was legally sane, but exhibited symptoms consistent with prolonged dissociative identity disturbance. The court rejected the defense. On March 15, 1988, Polyakov was convicted and sentenced to death. He was executed by firing squad on March 15, 1988, in the basement of Lubyanka prison. According to witnesses, Polyakov's last words were, "I served faithfully." He did not specify which service he meant. The aftermath of Polyakov's exposure reverberated through both the CIA and the GRU for years. For the CIA, the loss of Topat GT Bourbon was catastrophic. He had been one of the most productive agents in the history of American intelligence, and his exposure, along with the simultaneous compromise of at least 10 other Soviet sources due to Ames, effectively blinded U.S. intelligence to Soviet military intentions at a critical juncture in the Cold War's final phase. The CIA's post-mortem analysis, completed in 1991, concluded that Polyakov's intelligence had been worth incalculable strategic value and that his loss had set back American understanding of Soviet capabilities by at least 5 years. For the GRU, the revelation that one of their senior officers had been a CIA asset for 18 years triggered a comprehensive internal purge. Over 200 officers were reassigned, demoted, or dismissed. Security protocols were overhauled. The psychological screening process for intelligence officers was redesigned to identify potential vulnerabilities to recruitment. But the deeper damage was to institutional morale. If a decorated war veteran, a loyal Communist Party member, a man with no apparent motive for betrayal could sustain such a deception for nearly 2 decades, then the entire premise of trust within the intelligence apparatus was called into question. The declassification of Polyakov's case files, which began in the late 1990s and continued sporadically through the 2000s, has provided historians and intelligence analysts with a rare window into the psychological mechanics of deep-cover espionage. What emerges from these documents is a portrait of a man who did not simply betray one side for the other, but who became trapped in a state of perpetual, irresolvable duplicity. The journals, the interrogation transcripts, the psychiatric evaluations, all point to the same conclusion. Polyakov's identity had fractured under the sustained cognitive load of serving 2 masters, until the concept of a singular, coherent self became untenable. This raises a question that extends beyond Polyakov's individual case. What does sustained deception do to the human psyche? Intelligence agencies have long understood that double agents face psychological risks: stress, paranoia, moral injury. But Polyakov's case suggests something more fundamental: that the act of maintaining incompatible identities over extended periods can erode the very structures of self-awareness that allow individuals to distinguish between roles and authentic selfhood. Polyakov did not lose his mind in the clinical sense. He lost his ability to locate himself within the narratives he was performing. The Cold War intelligence literature is filled with cases of agents who defected, agents who were caught, agents who broke under interrogation. But Polyakov's case is almost unique in its depiction of an agent who ceased to understand the concept of sides. He did not switch allegiances. He dissolved the boundary that makes allegiance possible. In his final journal entry, dated June 30, 1986, a week before his arrest, Polyakov wrote, "I have served 2 nations for 18 years. I have betrayed 2 nations for 18 years." These statements are identical. I no longer know which is the truth. The strategic implications of Polyakov's intelligence contributions are well documented. His reporting on Soviet missile programs, military doctrine, and intelligence operations provided the United States with critical advantages during some of the Cold War's most dangerous moments. The CIA's internal assessment credits him with intelligence that likely prevented miscalculations that could have led to direct U.S.-Soviet military confrontation. From a purely operational standpoint, Polyakov was one of the most successful penetration agents in the history of espionage. But the human cost, both to Polyakov himself and to the dozens of people whose lives were destroyed by his exposure, complicates any straightforward assessment of his legacy. The agents he recruited for the GRU, believing they were serving Soviet intelligence, were in fact being used to maintain his cover and credibility. When Polyakov was exposed, many of these agents were also arrested, interrogated, and in some cases executed. They had not chosen to betray their countries. They had been unknowingly instrumentalized in a deception they did not understand. The moral calculus of espionage has always been brutal, but Polyakov's case illustrates its most paradoxical dimension. The agents who serve most effectively are often those who destroy most completely, not only the enemy's secrets, but the lives of those caught in the machinery of their duplicity. The question of what Polyakov believed, what he truly, authentically believed, remains unresolved. The declassified materials provide no clear answer. His interrogators could not extract one. His journals suggest he himself did not know. In the absence of a coherent motive, analysts have proposed various theories: that he was driven by resentment over a past overpromotion, that he sought validation from both superpowers simultaneously, that he was engaged in a form of ideological hedging, betting on both sides of the Cold War. But none of these explanations fully account for the evidence. The simpler, more disturbing possibility is that Polyakov had no single, stable motive because he had no single, stable identity. He had become the role, and the role had become plural. The CIA's final assessment of Polyakov, completed in 1992 after the Soviet Union's collapse, includes a passage that has since become a touchstone in intelligence training on the psychological risks of deep cover work. Top Hat's operational success was predicated on his ability to inhabit two incompatible identities with equal conviction. This ability, which made him invaluable as an asset, ultimately destroyed his capacity for self-recognition. The lesson is not that such agents are unreliable, but that the human psyche is not designed to sustain indefinite duplicity without structural damage. The question for future operations is whether such damage is an acceptable cost. That question has never been satisfactorily answered. Intelligence agencies continue to recruit and run double agents. The operational protocols have been refined, the psychological screening improved, the support mechanisms enhanced. But the fundamental tension remains. The qualities that make an agent effective in deep cover, adaptability, compartmentalization, the ability to perform contradictory roles convincingly, are the same qualities that, over time, erode the psychological coherence necessary for stable identity. Polyakov's case is not an outlier. It is the logical endpoint of a system that demands human beings become what they pretend to be. In the years since Polyakov's execution, his story has been studied by intelligence historians, psychologists, and ethicists as a case study in the limits of human adaptability under conditions of sustained deception. The consensus is that Polyakov was not a psychopath, not a sociopath, not mentally ill in any conventional sense. He was a man of above-average intelligence, strong ideological convictions, and genuine commitment to both the Soviet system he was born into and the American system he chose to serve. The tragedy is that these commitments, rather than being mutually exclusive, became mutually reinforcing until he could no longer distinguish between them. The final irony of Polyakov's case is that both sides claimed him. The CIA, in its internal histories, describes him as one of the greatest agents in American intelligence history, a man who risked everything to provide the United States with critical strategic advantage. The Russian government, in post-Soviet reassessments, has acknowledged his contributions to Soviet intelligence and noted that his exposure was the result of American betrayal, not his own failures. Both narratives are factually accurate. Both are incomplete. Polyakov served both. Polyakov betrayed both. The two statements are not contradictory. They are identical. What remains unknown, even after decades of declassification and analysis, is whether Polyakov ever experienced a moment of clarity, a point at which he recognized what he had become and made a conscious choice to continue or to stop. The journals suggest he did not. The interrogation transcripts suggest he could not. The psychiatric evaluations suggest the question itself may be meaningless, because the self that would have made such a choice had already fragmented beyond recovery. In the end, Dmitry Polyakov was not a man who forgot which side he was on. He was a man who discovered that the concept of sides, when inhabited with sufficient depth and duration, ceases to have meaning. The lesson of Polyakov's case is not about the mechanics of espionage, though it offers many. It is not about the strategic value of human intelligence, though his contributions were immense. It is about the limits of human identity under conditions of irresolvable contradiction. The Cold War demanded that individuals choose sides, pledge loyalty, commit treason. Polyakov did all of these things, simultaneously and with equal sincerity, until the contradictions consumed him. He destroyed both sides not through incompetence or malice, but through the simple, inexorable logic of becoming exactly what both sides needed him to be. In doing so, he ceased to be anyone at all.